I don't know exactly what I'm trying to get at here because I'm just making it up now, but it seems like this expansion that happens is like it seems like this expansion that happens expands beyond this reflex loop that we're in of just taking little things to always have this hit of pleasure, but not really expanding our sense of self. We're just expanding our pleasure, but we're becoming adapted to it. And this might be called the hedonic adaptation, like Jason Silva talks about. Because we can always become adapted to pleasure, but I don't know if we can be adapted to expansion. Because pleasure is just something like good. It's very simple. But expansion is rich. It's not just good. But when we first expand in something like mania, if we just think, oh, this is good, it's not just something that's good. Anyone that's experienced it isn't just thinking, this is good, this is pleasure. It's way beyond that. And I feel like it's trying to push away the pleasure because it does feel pleasurable, but we're so tied into pleasure right now. But if we see it as something that's just about pleasure, we're missing the point. It's not about personal pleasure at all. And that's actually one of the downfalls, is that we think it's about our personal pleasure when it's not. It's about expanding the sense of what and who we are. And when we do that, we see that we're all one, interconnected, interrelated. And when we feel that, we feel empathetic, we feel altruistic, we behave in different ways. We don't behave in self-serving ways because there is no self to serve. The self that we serve is getting pleasure. So pleasure is the self in a way. It's part of the self. So part of the trick of when this creative energy comes in is that it's so pleasurable that we think it's something for ourselves. And when we think that, it expands the self. And when it expands the self, we start thinking that the self is so great and we're Jesus or God or something. And then that's part of what collapses it again. Because if the creative energy is expanding like this, but we're expanding our ego at the same rate, then the cage can just capture that energy again. But if the energy expands and then the ego isn't expanded, it can really break it up. It can destroy the ego as opposed to just temporarily suspending it. So if one takes a drug to dissolve the ego, it's only temporary because the ego eventually recoalesces. But a lot of times that changes a person's life and then they act in different ways and then the ego structure isn't as solid. But the trouble with how it's all interpreted right now in terms of so-called mental illness, the problem is attributed to the self, meaning we need to get the self back, we need to get it functional, we need to get it working. So it's a problem of there's something wrong with that person, their self. But it's not seen as the problem is the self itself. And that is more of the problem than anybody's personal self. And I also had an insight about how the body isn't going to give us happy thoughts if we're not taking care of it. So I feel like some of what puts energy into scary thoughts later in the process of map consciousness is that a lot of times we start neglecting the body. And so some of those scary thoughts and things could just be the body saying, hello, you need to stop this moving around in meaning and action and potential and possibilities and perception and actually see that there's still a body that this is all connected to. And unless you want to go off into some amorphous light body form, you better start taking care of the body. So the fear starts coming in, and then the fear starts to allow the ego to recoalesce because fear is anti-creativity, which is fear is part of the ego. So that's why I feel it's important to start the day right as someone with this type of consciousness, because later on in the day we can get lost in other things And if we've at least gotten up and done all those things first, then even if we're not paying as much attention to our body or eating as healthy or eating at all the rest of the day, at least we've done some gestures towards acknowledging that the body's there and that it needs to be taken care of for sure. And I realized that a theme that I've been talking about along the way is being a little bit disgruntled about how it's not really being acknowledged that people who are labeled with mental illnesses go into an overflow, at least in some cases with so-called bipolar disorder and schizophrenia perhaps, though I don't have experience with that exactly. So it's not really being acknowledged, but I have found little tidbits of things. And so that's part of what I'm actually doing, is acknowledging, not asking someone else to acknowledge it, but acknowledging for myself that this is a very creative process. It's part of flow. It's part of altered states. It's part of dissolution of the self. It's part of so many things that this energy that moves through us as human beings is attempting to do. It's a different doing than what we're trying to do as humans, protecting ourselves as separate egos. It's trying to bring us together in a way. So I'm officially acknowledging that. And I'm reading a book called 1000 by Ramaji, and it's a really good book actually. I would definitely recommend this book, 1000, the number 1000 by Ramaji, and also Stealing Fire by Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel. After the first chapter on Navy SEALs, it gets really good, because even though they're not talking about people labeled with mental illnesses specifically, if one with a label takes the time to read it with an open context, then one will read a lot about one's brain and how powerful it is. And Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel talk about the 4 elements of flow, or ecstasis that they call it. And people that go into mania definitely feel ecstasy. And they say the 4 bits of it are selflessness, timelessness, effortlessness, and richness. Those 4 words are very important. That's exactly what the state feels like. So we definitely go into ecstasis, and that's not as much of a problem, though it can be when people feel so abundant that they spend all their money and things like that. But we can learn not to do that. It's more that it's really powerful and also a prolonged period of time. Even though it's a timeless state, it goes on for a long time. Even though it's an effortless state, there can be a lot of effort that has to be carried out afterwards to sort of integrate it and come back from that ecstasis. And even though there's so much richness, after the fact, if one is labeled with a mental illness, it can actually lead to a life very, very devoid of richness. And even though it's a selfless state, after the fact, for someone labeled with mental illness, it can lead to a life of picking up the pieces of the self, or trying to protect the self, or trying to feed the self, or so many things. So the trouble with ecstasis, when it comes to it leading to others perceiving one as needing help and giving the type of help that they do in terms of psychopharmacology and all that comes with it, it can lead to actually a life of those 4 elements of ecstasis being ripped to shreds and actually turned upside down and amplified a million times. So that's the trouble, and there's so much to that. And that book is really good for that. And there's some parts I want to talk about because they're really important. It's really important for people to know this kind of stuff for themselves, who go into these ecstatic states without even really wanting to. even though when they're in it, they love it and they probably wish for it because we're always wishing for the good. But I don't think it's a great idea to sit back and wish for the good and live in a contracted way. But if we can live in a micro expanded way, then when that huge expansion comes in, we'll actually be able to move with it more and not necessarily have such a fallout from it because we're already moving in those ways. So the 1000 book, 1000 by Ramaji, had a really interesting blurb in it that caught my attention. And he said, there's no course out there that he knows of to help deal with the inflation problem, which is the inflation of the self, the inflation of the ego. Because a lot of people come into contact with this problem of inflation. And he says there's innocent inflation and then there's pathological inflation. And to me, the self or the ego is a pathology in general, and we all have it. The trouble is if something happens to the self that we all think is normal, then we're labeled with a pathology. So if our self gets too expanded and we feel like we're God compared to usual, then we're trying to get this little self back, which is also a pathology. And the book says, don't believe in your own hype. And I found that interesting because that's something that I've been saying to myself all along is don't believe anything that I say. And I don't believe anything that I say. The element that believes is the self. The self is the believer of beliefs. It is the belief and the believer. The self itself is a belief that believes itself. So I probably have talked to myself about quite a few different tips to avoid this ego inflation. And one of them is not to believe anything that I say. And that also makes room for the next possibility of something to say. And to go with that, don't believe or have a hope in any of the ideas, because a hope is attached to the self hoping, and then that attaches it to memory, and it leads it to be something that we need to remember to hope for. So there's trouble with attaching psychological ideas or any kind of idea to a me. And there were actually some tips at the end of the book, Stealing Fire, on this, because they were saying that there's this selfless feeling. And so they said one of the tips of that is it's not about you. And I've said that it's not about the me. Belief creates the me. And then it also says, in terms of the timelessness, it's not about now. And I've said this too, that we get a huge download in map consciousness, but there's no way we can do it all now. But since it feels so eternal and timeless in that space, we feel like it all has to happen now or is happening now. But it's more of just a download, a blueprint, a map. It's a download that expands our map of possibilities for the future, but it's not necessarily happening right now. But it's almost creating some of the brain cells to see some of those elements as salient as we continue on our journey. So in that visionary state, one could just feel like this isn't about now, but pay attention to some of these elements as they're being downloaded as brain salience. And in terms of effortlessness, they said, don't be a bliss junkie. And that was something I was just talking about, that it feels really good, but it's not about the good, it's about the expansion. And part of expansion is learning. So if we're always learning, then we're definitely expanding. And that space of map consciousness I've already talked about a lot is hyper learning. So that's part of why it feels so good. So instead of just chasing the feeling of good, can we learn? Can we expand in daily life? So then that way this hyper learning space doesn't necessarily have to come in, and then it feels good. But if we're learning in micro amounts in daily life, so that's part of the daily practice, is learning. So I noticed the last 2 days I read some things on creativity that actually got my mind going with insights, instead of just maybe reading tweets about supposed mental illness that get me kind of annoyed. And the richness domain, they said, don't dive too deep. And for me, now that this insight and harvest practice and body thing has been a daily thing, not just a 1 month out of the year thing, since it's so embodied, I don't have to feel like I have to get to it right away or have to write down every insight that I have. Like, it feels so important because it feels so infinite and eternal and always possible. So I can just turn it off and turn it on and not feel like it's so important. Because when that first happens in map consciousness, we feel like it's so important, it's so valuable. But if we're able to do that in micro amounts every day and learn and harvest, practice, and body, then it's just part of life. And then it doesn't really inflate the ego as much as feeling like this is so important and I have to do this now. And it doesn't feel like something that has to be now because it's something that's always possible. So it's a little bit of a paradox, or it's kind of the opposite in a way of this timelessness tip that they give in the book. Like, it's not now. And I think that it's not now gets resolved when one realizes it could be any time. So if one is in flow or a high state of consciousness or ecstasis, one's going to feel like this is so important, this is so valuable, I got to do this now. And one might come out of that and then feel like, okay, well, I can harvest this and practice it and embody it and integrate it. But eventually, it just happens at the same time. So then it's always now. I don't know if that makes any sense. If one is going into flow or extreme states randomly or by some kind of volitional act, one's going to find them really important. But if one is able to take some of that, harvest, practice, and body, do micro expansions in daily life, then one doesn't need to chase any kind of deep dive or wish for it. Some people might do deep dives with some kind of substance, but some of us, we just go into a deep dive of expanded consciousness and ecstasis without wanting to or without volition. So I feel like doing these micro amounts in daily life, that big rush of it won't necessarily need to happen because it's always happening in real time. Because even with this process that they're talking about now, going into flow and then coming out of it and resting and thinking about it and sort of preparing for the next experience that we might go into volitionally, there's still a self in between those flow spaces. But what if it's not this hyper meaning state, this hyper learning state, this hyper energy state, and then this less than state where we're kind of sitting and waiting for the next, but always a significantly more energetic state where one is able to expand and learn all the time. So we're not so much an ego that had this big meaningful experience and then is thinking about it and hoping for the next time as an ego self, but just always a process of learning. So can we go from being an ego self to just a compass and a map and a learner? Just a process of learning. Because the ego is that which would not learn or be sitting there hoping for the next time, meanwhile not learning. So it can go like this, the energy like this, until it's just always micro expanding, and then it's always now, and then there never was a me, and then bliss is just replaced by the joy of being and learning in the moment, every moment, and it's always rich. And there's no need for a deep dive of richness because there's such an infinite kaleidoscope of richness. Because that's the thing too, if somebody goes into flow, they might start thinking, well, this is what flow is. So I need to do this particular thing to get into this particular flow because this is flow. And that's maybe feeling like a major flow event in contrast to the ego. But when there's no ego to contrast it to as much, then what is it? It can't just be this unidirectional thing all the time. One might feel like it's possible to always be flowing. And when one is, there's no space for this ego that would stop to retrospect and plan for the next one. Can we go from being an ego to just a space of flow? And I think I wrote some notes about that later, but so the ego is the mechanism by which we believe. It's the me that believes. And when there's no time to believe. We don't need an entity there to believe something that we say. We can just say it. There's no believer of what we say. But when we do that, we tether what we said to this invisible entity which creates the entity, which is just a bunch of words spinning around. So also by deactivating belief, we can deactivate some of this inflation, because the ego is that which believes. So if we're not believing, we're not inflating that mechanism of belief, which is the ego. So don't bring in the believer, just be the receiver and the perceiver. Just because we perceive something doesn't mean that belief has to be there in any way, shape, or form. So the 1000 book by Ramaji said, I don't know of any course that helps to deal with the problem of inflation, of the ego, of the self. And he said there's no course offered on how to deal with these challenges. And I feel like that is a major challenge for us who go into map consciousness, is this ego inflation. Because again, it's an expansion that will kind of inflate or expand whatever's there operating. And we can see for ourselves what this does in our life, because this energy comes in and expands that ego, and look what happens. It's usually a big mess and a disaster. So where else can that energy be channeled? Or I feel, and I think I've talked about this, is the energy actually inflates it partly to make it more visible to us. So usually the ego structure is operating invisibly as ourself, as necessary, as what is. But then it becomes visible. Before it was invisible. It's a transparent self model, as Thomas Metzinger would say. But the energy comes in, and by expanding the ego self, it actually makes it more obvious what it's doing. And then we usually enact a lot of that out. So can we use some of that energy to just perceive what it's doing, and then when we perceive that, a lot of it drops away, possibly. So this could be one of the biggest challenges, the number one challenge of people who go into map consciousness, is this ego inflation. It's not about me, and not even the so-called psychosis is about me. And that's a tough one. That's a really tough one, because when we're expanding and we feel like God, it's cool to think, wow, this is all about me. But when it's contracting and there might be something like a psychosis, well, the trouble is there's scary images, and we usually do think this is about me, and we think we're bad and all of this. But really, the self structure is not coherent. When it's expanding like that, it's not coherent, and we see that. And then when it's contracting and scary stuff's being projected, it's not coherent still. So it's not about, oh, this side is good and this side's bad. Both sides aren't coherent. And one side we like and one side we don't like. But it's not about like and dislike. It's about showing this whole structure and what it's doing. And then look what it does to our life as a result. Very quickly, when we have this expanded version of it, and then the goal of recovery is to get the little contracted version of it working again good, but that is very limited. When we see how it really works, we might move beyond it instead of trying to get the little version of it going again indefinitely. And also, this is what the ego does, is it projects. So it's going to project all these wonderful feelings and beliefs in so-called mania, and then terrible ones in psychosis. And it's not about this is good and this is bad. It's all a projection. So again, it's when we just look at the good and the bad, we miss the fundamental roots of what it's all showing about the projection element, about the believing element, about the me. All parts that aren't actually really there. They're actually projecting and reinforcing an illusion of a separate self. And the trouble is, there's a trick there that makes us believe that it's about the me. But really, the trick is that it's all a bunch of make-believe. There's a process here that makes it believe it's about the me, but this is the ultimate make-believe. Because really, we might see that the ego is a game of make-believe. And the ultimate make-believe is that there is a self to make-believe. It's a loop. Can we go from believe to perceive? And then not believing perceptions, but acting on perceptions. Or having the perception act on the brain so that we can see more. And that's the expansion. Perception acting on the brain so then we can see more. Can we perceive, receive, and then recite and just speak, not as a me, not as belief, but just speaking as we perceive? And what's really the difference between thinking and believing? To me, they're both part of memory. So what I'm trying to say is that our thinking is from memory and our belief is from memory. So really, we're just speaking as a bunch of memories. We're not actually speaking as we perceive in the moment now. We're speaking as the past. And so that means that we're not seeing anything now. And in the book Stealing Fire, Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel give a little equation, which is value of a state or something is equal to time times reward over risk. And so they use time as the time it takes to acquire the skill, and then reward over the risk. And I feel like risk in terms of somebody who goes into map consciousness involuntarily can be reduced by harvest, practice, and body. If we're practicing that risky state when we're not in that risk at all, it's actually going to decrease the risk. In the same way, people practice flying airplanes in a simulator. So when they go up into the actual plane, their risk is greatly reduced because they practiced. So the equation, in a way, would be practice decreases risk. So that would change it to times practice, which is part of time. So none of these are really separate. And then imagine if you can actually decrease the reward, but so in a state of mania, somebody feels like it's a big reward. So say that's like 100% reward or something like that, but we're only in it for, say, 30 days before it craps out on us, and then there's a big fallout, and that makes the risk greater and actually decreases the reward. But if we can actually decrease the reward by practicing, which is decrease all the pleasure-y stuff, but there would be a different reward happening of learning. So reward is usually tied to pleasure, but can we tie it more to expansion and learning? And as we expand and learn, the amount of pleasure is actually reduced, but we're all pleasure adapted. So yeah, I'm trying to say that reward is kind of learning and expansion and not pleasure. And then instead of having 30 days in the state, we might have 360 days in the state. So we can actually increase our time in the states, and the reward changes in quality from just pleasure to a richness. And the risk actually goes down with practice when we're not in that space as much. And then actually, as we're practicing not being in the space, we're actually finding that now we're more kind of in the space than not. So I think there's a different equation arising that I might have to write down in order to figure out.